Hey everyone, so I am staying in my friend Russ Hamilton's house, one of the original OGs in the sport of disc golf, and I just woke up and I'm surrounded by a pre-1987 wall of golf discs. So I thought just for fun I'd do a quick little history of the golf disc from someone who was there. So this may be in a couple parts, but the origin of the golf disc, I mean, Wham-O was the pioneer of the only one making frisbees in the early days of the sport that mattered. And when disc golf became a thing in the mid-70s, Wham-O came up with the idea of making golf discs. Now, the way they made golf discs was they took their famous store-bought, 119, and they called it 119. It was 119 grams. And they renamed it the 40 mold, added a little bit of weight, made it heavier, made it glow in the dark. Made the Midnight Flyer. They also, they add more weight to the 50 mold, or to the 141. Called it a 50 mold. Wham-O wasn't they drove the sport in the early days for the sport of frisbee, but they weren't the most clever, innovative golf disc manufacturers. In fact, their big innovation was that after a couple years of making golf discs, when they wanted to really push disc technology further, they started making them pink, and they didn't glow in the dark. So that was their big thing. This was big news in the sport in like 1981. So the two things about the early golf discs was the first was that because they weren't beveled edge, they required a lot more spin relative to the speed. That's why in the early days of the sport, you watch players throwing, a lot of them are throwing with their arms curled around like this. You had to put more spin in the disc. The second thing about these discs was there was no such thing as an overstable golf disc. When you threw this disc flat, it would either turn a little bit to the right or a lot to the right, but nothing flew to the left. That didn't exist in the early days of the sport. In fact, this is the biggest reason why some of the most amazing disc athletes from the early days, like in the 70s, the Rose Bowl days, early 80s, a lot of them never made the transition to golf discs because you didn't throw a disc you couldn't throw these discs like that. You threw them like this. So it was really tough for people to kind of make that transition for a lot of people. Other thing about these early frisbees, you can still call them frisbees because Wham-O owned the trademark to the name frisbee, was that they were breakable. And when I say breakable, I mean when you went out to one of the early courses, if there was a hole with a lot of trees on it, you would literally see pieces of plastic littering the ground. And I'm not exaggerating. You look down, you could count 50 little pieces of plastic all over the place. These discs would hit a tree, they would explode. Now, you couldn't buy these in stores. The only place you could buy the early Wham-O golf discs was if someone had the gumption to drive down to the Wham-O factory, or you could order them online, I suppose, back east. I wasn't there. And they would buy 50 of these, and they would stick them in the trunk of their car, and they'd pull up to the golf course when they got off work and open their trunk, and that's where you bought golf discs. And so this is where the sport started. Now, I think we'll have to do this in several parts because I have a crappy phone with not a lot of memory. But the farthest flying disc in the early days was the 70 mold, which actually this happens to be a 70 mold. It was the smallest of all of the Wham-O golf discs, but by small, it was still huge by today's standards. So a forgotten pioneer in disc development by the name of Jan Sobel, it's a he, created a company called Destiny Discs, eventually renamed the Dynamic Discs. It was the first dynamic disc. And Jan came up with the idea of making a disc even smaller. And what Jan came up with was a disc called the Puppy. Now, the Puppy wasn't beveled edge. It was probably most similar to, say, a Birdie or a Polecat or, oh gosh, a lot of companies have a version, a non-beveled version, but came up with the idea of the Puppy. Well, actually, it was a Puppy, and then, which the Puppy actually flew straight. Then he came up with the idea of the Super Puppy, which was basically the same disc. It was a tiny bit more stable. But at the time, we actually thought, not everybody obviously, but we thought that this technology had hit its pinnacle. Because you can't make a disc smaller than a Puppy. There's a point of diminishing return. It's not going to fly anymore, right? So we thought it had completely, the sport peaked at the Puppy. Now I take a couple side tours on this. A company called Benoit came out with a Puppy also. And this disc was called the generic golf disc. And I'm going to hold it up and then I'm going to read what it says. So the generic golf disc was just a puppy, but the hot stamp of the disc actually read generic golf disc, adequate driver, breakable plastic. They advertised that it was average and breakable. And for some reason, nobody would buy these. That's weird, right? So that's where we thought this technology had gone. Now, as a little bit of trivia, and don't let anybody debate this. We were there. A disc came out with a beveled edge called, well, we called it the Wedge. It had a couple different names for different courses. It was a beveled edge disc called the Wedge. Now, the thing about the Wedge was it was almost a prototype because it wasn't commercially available and it didn't fly as far as the puppy, but it was overstable. It was the first overstable golf disc. But it's a side note in the history of the sport because it did nothing to propel the sport forward. It wasn't part of the history of the sport. It was just some company made a frisbee with beveled edge. The sport changed in 1983 when this disc came out. Now this was the Innova Eagle. This is the